You've probably heard the expression since you were maybe even a small child, hindsight, it's 2020. Now, what does this really mean? Why do we hear it so much? And what does it really mean as a society when we tend to actually think that this is actually true? Well, what we mean when we're saying hindsight is 2020, we're really saying that if I could have had the knowledge that I have now about a past event, I could have made a better, more informed decision that could have led to an outcome that I wanted. Let's give an example of a time when hindsight is actually 100% helpful and it would have been nice to have. You have two doors in front of you, one on the left, one on the right. The door on the left has $100 million behind it. The door on the right has a clown who hits you with a bat in the head as soon as you open it. Now, you opened the door on the right, got hit in the head, and you lost out on this life-changing money. Now, this would be an example where you really could say, man, hindsight's 2020. I wish I'd opened that left door. Now, that's absolutely an example of a time when hindsight would have helped you and would have brought you to the best outcome possible. But I think that we don't really think about all the times that hindsight actually would have harmed us if we had had it at the time. And in fact, it might even harm our distortion of reality now. It might even make us think that some things had to have happened a certain way when it's not really the case. So what is an example of how hindsight could actually distort reality? Well, I'm sure you've heard of, well, maybe you haven't, but a lot of people have heard of the example. It's kind of like a moral dilemma. Something like, would you kill baby Hitler? Or would you kill, Mao Zedong if he was an infant in front of you? And the way a lot of people will justify, no, I would never kill this child, is they say, well, I don't know what the world is going to look like after Hitler. I mean, if I got rid of him and we never had World War II, I don't know, man. I mean, where are we going to be at? What is the world going to look like? Maybe we don't have all the innovations. Maybe the world is actually destabilized without this giant event that was World War II. But what you're actually doing here is you're using this hindsight is 2020 lens to paint yourself into having to choose abject suffering for other humans. Because basically what you're saying is, I'm guaranteeing harm to tens and tens of millions of people across the world just because I know that we're going to land on our feet afterwards. But we're just playing off the assumption that this suffering was absolutely necessary and that the suffering actually helped us in some way. But truly, this is an example of when hindsight is actually blinding our perspective. And in fact, hindsight is actually a skewed perspective in this. I would actually argue that if there's any way that you can prevent Hitler from becoming what he did, you actually have a moral obligation to do so, to prevent it from happening. You have no proof that without Hitler we would be worse off. And so this would extend to many different historical events and figures. Would you just allow Genghis Khan to just murder and pillage so much of the Eastern world? Just because China's doing okay now. The Eastern Hemisphere's pretty stable now for the most part. But it just seems like a very skewed perspective to simply say, well, I know that we land on our feet afterwards, so I'm willing to allow this suffering because I'm so scared of the potential outcome of removing the suffering. But you have to think, what are the odds that killing Hitler or Mao Zedong or Genghis Khan is actually going to result in more harm actually being done? The odds of that seem extremely low to me. And if you really just think about it intuitively, there's almost no way to even make this probable. You're saying that by me eliminating this child who will later on go on to murder tens of millions, that somehow this could cause harm on a greater scale? It seems like we're just playing the hindsight game and using this biased perspective to justify that we're living in the best timeline and that everything has to happen for a reason. You were not supposed to get that promotion. Your wife was supposed to die in this car accident. All of these crazy games we play with ourselves because, well, frankly, it's a way to cope with the reality that we're in. And in that way, it makes sense because what you're doing is you're painting a way for you to accept the present that you're having to walk and live in. Well, World War II had to happen. 9/11 had to happen. Because if it didn't happen, where would we be now? I wouldn't have TSA checking my bags for bombs. If it wasn't for World War II, we wouldn't have the European Union, or we wouldn't have all of these great allies across the world. But these are just assumptions that we're playing ourselves with so that we can try to justify what we've been through and to say that we couldn't have made a better decision, or that if we went back, we wouldn't make a better decision because in hindsight, maybe it was all necessary. But this is what I'm trying to get to with this idea. Hindsight is actually one of the most dangerous ways to view a lot of events, but especially historical and world events. But you can even scale this down. Many people will be in maybe a relationship or a bad marriage for 10 or 20 years. And in hindsight, they'll simply say, well, I had a child in this relationship, or maybe not even that. Maybe it just made me a better person, made me the person I am now. And again, it's almost, and don't get me wrong, you can definitely see why somebody would try to frame it this way or try to make it seem like this. They're trying to justify that it was all necessary and it was all part of a grand plan for them to become what they are now. But truly, this isn't necessarily the case. It could absolutely be that if you had gotten out of the relationship 20 years earlier, you could have become just as wise or even wiser of a person, maybe even earlier in your life. Maybe if we could have removed Hitler and we could have prevented World War II, maybe we would have had the internet in the 60s. Maybe we would already have ASI and robotics, and we'd already have a bunch of robot butlers making me food and folding my laundry. Do I know that? No. But I also don't know that removing him would cause more suffering than leaving him. And it also raises the question of, are you not causing a moral harm through your inaction of not removing the person? What do I mean by this? It's kind of a word salad. Well, what I mean by this is, if you had baby Genghis Khan in front of you, and you decided, no, I need to make sure that history plays out the way that I know it will. Isn't this inaction, in a way, inadvertently causing tons and tons of abject suffering? But you've rationalized it in your head as necessary. This is what I mean when I say hindsight is a biased and skewed perspective. It's something we're using to justify the present that we're in, always assuming that it was all needed and possible. But it goes without saying, if you ask any of the people having to live through these abject, horrible points in human history, they would all tell you, no, please kill him as a child. Please throw him over the river. Please get him out. Please, please, please do something. And now this is always, this whole thought experiment is assuming that your only two choices were killing or non-killing. So the way that I kind of came to this mental conclusion was I was playing the same moral dilemma of, killing baby Hitler. And I said in my head, no, I wouldn't kill him. And I said the same exact thing that most of you would, or at least a lot of you would, that I don't know what the outcome is going to be. And I feel like that was such a big event. It was necessary for us to be in the world I'm in now. And I love the world I'm in now. I love living. It's a good world. But then I thought about it. And I thought, let's say I teleported myself back to 1909. Or let's change it, 2025. A child lays in front of you. And a note from 40 years in the future. The note reads, "This child will lead to the abject suffering and murder of tens of millions of people across the world and will end in the destabilization of the West as you know it. You only have two options. You may murder the child, or you may leave the child unable to alter his course." What would you do? Well, when you remove the hindsight bias and you no longer know the long-term outcome, it now feels like you have to do it. Because, by God, I could save 50 million lives if I just get rid of this one child who will become an objective evil. It depends on really how you want to determine good or evil. So I'm even a little bit worried using that word in the video. But for me, I'd say I'm loose utilitarian. I wouldn't say hardcore utilitarian. So for me, this would look like causing suffering with no clear benefit. So it wouldn't count pulling a splinter out. You caused suffering by damaging me. There was still a benefit. I got the splinter out. So does what we're talking about only apply to these big, grand, civilization-wide events? No, not necessarily. I mean, what about economic crashes? What about the Great Depression? What about the housing crisis in 2008 in America? There are plenty of these things that I feel like we look at and say, well, look at the boom afterwards. Well, maybe we could have had a better boom without all the suffering, man. It doesn't mean that it was necessary. We just assume that because it's what makes us feel good. It's what makes us believe in this lie that hindsight is 20/20. again, I think you can see mentally why people would play these gymnastics with themselves. But I think when you really try to look to the core of it, you're just looking through a skewed lens. And you're doing it because you want the present you're living in to be the best one, to be the one that you'd want to live in, because you have no other choice. It's the one you're stuck in. But I think truly, if you zoom out, you realize that, no, there probably was a better way to do all of this in the past, and maybe hindsight is actually not 20/20, but maybe hindsight is wrong.